right now we're digging into the way that Americans are preparing for the reopening of their local economies as we see more and more states reopen their economies. Of course, Georgia leading the way, and now we are getting Texas, the most populous state to do so since the coronavirus lockdown, pushed a lot of businesses into closings to protect people from across the country. An interesting new poll from Reuters and Ipsos, though, looked into how Americans are thinking about these plans right now. We should note from that poll, fewer than half of Americans plan to go to sporting events, concerts, movies, and amusement parks when they reopen to the public until there's a proven coronavirus vaccine. So even though these plans are being made to reopen economies, it will be interesting to watch how many people actually choose to go out and frequent these businesses once they are open again. But I want to shift to the plans that we're seeing come out of Texas right now, since plans are to reopen that state when the stay-at-home orders in that state are lifted come Thursday, with openings in Friday. And for more on that, I want to get to Kristin Myers on how Texas will be reopened. Kristin?
Zach. So obviously, as we've been talking, Georgia leading the charge, reopening on Friday, and yesterday opening those restaurants and businesses. South Carolina also joined Georgia in doing a partial reopen. But Texas, as you mentioned, the most populated state on the list, also one of the most hard-hit states when it comes to these positive coronavirus cases. So Governor Greg Abbott has actually decided to reopen the state. As you mentioned, that stay-at-home order is expiring on Thursday. And so Friday, stores and businesses are going to be allowed to reopen. Now, in his decision to open up the state, Governor Greg Abbott said, quote, this strategic approach to opening the state of Texas prioritizes the health and safety of our communities and follows the guidelines laid out by our team of medical experts. Now more than ever, Texans must remain committed to safe distancing practices that reduce the spread of COVID-19, and we must continue to rely on doctors and data to provide us with the safest strategies to restore Texans' livelihoods. We must also focus on protecting the most vulnerable Texans from exposure to COVID-19. If we remain focused on protecting the lives of our fellow Texans, we can continue to open the Lone Star State. Now, similar to Georgia, some of the businesses, that are allowed to reopen in Texas include all retail stores, restaurants, movie theaters, and malls. But there are some restrictions there, Zach, on the reopening of those businesses. And they're as follows. So they have to limit their capacity to 25% of their occupancy. So that's obviously a much smaller pool of people that are going to be allowed to go to these malls and these restaurants. Food courts, buffets, things like that will have to remain shut down. Museums and libraries are also going to be allowed to open, and they will also be allowed to open under those same restrictions and guidelines as those restaurants, those malls, and those movie theaters. Now, places of worship, they've been open and they're allowed to remain open. And interestingly, as you were mentioning about sports, outdoor sports are also allowed to resume, but there you're not allowed to have any more than 4 players going at a time. I'm not entirely sure how many sports you're going to be allowed to play with just 4 people and less. So no to soccer, no to baseball, no to football. That's going to be done. But anything less, anything with only 2 or 3 people, you're allowed to keep on doing that. I want to put this in context, though. As I was mentioning, Texas is one of the hardest hit states in the country for coronavirus cases. And I remember when we were talking just yesterday about Georgia, we showed the curve in that state. Well, it's pretty similar in Texas. We are not seeing that curve flatten. We're not seeing the other side of that curve. We're not seeing any sort of decline. And that's according to the Texas Health and Human Services. Just yesterday, they had over 650 cases, new cases. They have almost 26,000 cases in the state alone, with almost 700 fatalities in the state. So again, as we're seeing with Georgia, with South Carolina, with some of these other states, we're going to have to see if the reopening of the state is going to cause a large spike in these new cases and in these fatalities. Reopening states has actually caused the predictions. There's been a couple of predictive models out there. That's actually caused that number to be revised upward. That's pretty unfortunate news. Obviously, collectively as a country, we're trying to see those cases really decline, really start to flatten. Well, it turns out that those numbers actually might start jumping, that death toll might start jumping. According to the University of Washington, they have a predictive model that is being heavily relied on right now by the White House and the administration. They've actually revised that number to 74,000 deaths by August, particularly with so many states deciding to reopen their economies and reopen their businesses. Now, I do want to mention that right now, currently, according to the CDC, when I checked it right before we hopped on here, that the death toll stood at right about 54,000. So, I mean, we're looking at another 16,000 deaths potentially as these states start to reopen their businesses. It's obviously terrible news. No one wants to hear about 74,000 people, dying by August. So we're really going to have to see how Texas's decision, how Georgia's decision, how Louisiana's decision is going to really impact the number of cases that we're going to be seeing in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, and not only those cases, but also hospitalizations and ICU rates as well. When we think about what new metrics we're watching as everything continues to shift. And even those numbers, Chris, I mean, when we look at that, still down considerably from what was originally kind of prescribed to have happened when we looked at what could happen here in the U.S. And at least that number is a little bit below not only the White House projections, but also some projections that had happened right when this crisis began. But no doubt we will continue to track how those cases and hospitalizations go as these states reopen throughout the week and beyond. But thank you very much for highlighting that.
Hey investors, Zack Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.